Hosts Kyle and Chris.
Welcome back, one and all, to another episode of the Two Tongues Podcast. While I adjust my microphone, bear with me. What's up, you guys? Got an exciting episode for you today. It's exciting for me. I don't know if it will be for you. Well, where to begin? So I'm calling this episode Paleo Deo. A little phrase I was toying around with years ago. Paleo Deo. This is just an idea of the most ancient idea of God, right? Paleo Deo. It's an idea that was inspired by maybe some of my own intuition growing up about the nature of God, but also a particular scholar who I encountered in, maybe high school or early in college, a fellow named Wilhelm Schmidt. He's a Catholic priest, but also an anthropologist, kind of an important anthropologist, an early one. A lot of modern scientists have a little bit of a chip on their shoulder when it comes to priests in academia. It's like, look, if you believe in God, I can't trust anything you're going to say about science, that kind of a thing. And I think it's silly and stupid. And for that reason, Wilhelm Schmidt has been forgotten largely. Some of that has to do with the fact that he was German and not all of his stuff has been translated into English. I read everything of his that was translated into English. But to give you an example, his masterwork, what he's known for, it's like a mini volume set that walks through this theory of his, this idea of a primitive monotheism, the idea that the earliest forms of religion, and even prior to organized religion, the earliest forms of spirituality all surrounded this idea of a divine unity, of one God, of a kind of radical monotheism. And he makes a compelling argument for it. And there's smaller books of his that you can read if you're interested in English. He wrote a book called Primitive Monotheism, or maybe it's called Primitive Revelation. He wrote a book called High Gods of North America, which we'll talk a little bit about today, that kind of explain this whole theory of his surrounding primitive monotheism. And really the pushback is this. Most anthropologists believe that monotheism developed late in history, and religion itself developed from all kinds of things. There's various suggestions. None of it is certain. I mean, how would you be certain? Some of the anthropologists talk about ancestor worship as being the beginning of it. Other people talk about sympathetic magic as being the beginning of it. And this is silly in a lot of ways, but maybe not completely unmerited. It's the idea that you might come to the notion of a spiritual reality by coincidence, by a series of coincidences. So the idea is, let's say you find a very odd looking stone while you're hunting, you pick it up, and immediately after that you see a buck, you shoot it, you bring it home and you feed your family. And you start to think, well, I found this odd shaped stone. I picked it up. I'd never seen anything quite like it. It drew my attention. But the moment I had this special stone and I was out there looking for food, right? Looking for animals, not easy to find in the wilderness. I find this stone and there is the deer, right? So maybe there's a connection between this unusual stone and my success in the hunt. Maybe I take this stone with me next time I go hunting. And sure enough, there's another buck and I have a successful hunt. Now I'm convinced this stone is magic. And there must be this unexplainable, invisible, magical part of reality, right? This is this idea of sympathetic magic that might introduce people to the notion of spirituality or something like that. And there's lots of others. The idea of watching somebody die is I think, a pretty strong argument as well. It's like you see the breath leave the person and you see them transform. If you've seen a dead body, you know what I mean. There's something very eerie about it. It looks like a living person, but something's changed. And it's a little fucking freaky. When you're little and you first encounter that, it's unsettling. So the idea is that you can sense with the exiting of the final breath, something critical to life in the body is gone. And so the idea of a soul connected to the breath leaving the body, the thing that is alive in you leaves with the breath, and all these sorts of ideas. And there's some sense in it. And I can't write any of that off. But I do think this idea, this prevailing idea that the earliest forms of spirituality or religion surrounded a world full of spirits or a world full of gods. This is what we call polytheism, the belief in many gods. I think that argument, even though it's accepted widely, is flawed. And it's not even challenging to see the flaws in it. And I just want to maybe try to paint this picture for you today. I want to try to vindicate for you Wilhelm Schmidt and his work. I'm not going to use a whole lot of Wilhelm's arguments. What I want to do is share with you how I came around to this Schmittian idea. I want to share to you some of the things that have reinforced this idea as I've studied religion and spirituality that make me think Wilhelm Schmidt has something correct here. But also, there's a reason why I am coming across as biased in favor of Wilhelm Schmidt. And I just want to be honest with you that I have had my own religious experiences, my own mystical experiences that are very personal and compelling. I've said before, for me, after having a mystical experience, religious ideas or beliefs are no longer a matter of belief. It's not a matter of, it's a certainty because I've had an experience. And so there's no questioning that. I wasn't make-believe. It wasn't a hallucination. I had an experience that proved to me in no uncertain terms that there is a God, and we can argue about what that means, and that nothing exists apart from that thing we're calling God. There is a divine cosmic unity that comes with, or at least that intuition that comes with these mystical and spiritual experiences that people have. And it is almost universal. People who have these experiences come out saying, I was one with the universe, God is everything, all is one. And the mystics say these things over and over and over again. And I've said before, and I'll say again, I think the idea of monotheism, the idea of a belief in one God, or the idea that the divine is one thing, it is a encompassing unity, that this is an instinct, this is an intuition that comes from spiritual experience. If you have an encounter with God, you will come out not thinking that there is only one God. Because I know that these types of experiences have been had since time immemorial. They were happening to human beings in the Stone Age, just like they're happening to human beings today. And every one of the folks who had these experiences had the same feeling that I'm describing, more or less. And you may say that I'm taking a leap there, but if you read accounts of mystical experiences or psychedelic experiences that are religious or spiritual in nature, near-death experiences and out-of-body experiences and all these sorts of things, categories that perhaps are all the same or similar, people say the same thing over and over and over. If you pick up a little book called Cosmic Consciousness by Maurice Buck, if you read William James' Varieties of Religious Experience, there's all sorts of compilations of trip accounts and mystical experiences. You can read them going back hundreds of years, and in some cases, a couple thousand years, right? You can do that, and you're going to find the same general description of a divine cosmic unity. Now, I was introduced to a symbolic way of understanding this by Dr. Jordan Peterson in his book Maps of Meaning, and I've talked about it ad nauseum, and this is probably going to be a little bit of a longer episode, so I don't want to get bogged down in the details. But what Jordan presents is one of the most ancient myths that we have, the Enuma Elish from ancient Mesopotamia. And in that creation account, which is far older than the biblical text, far older than any extant religious text, it talks about a divine unity there in the beginning. What the universe comes from, what all of the beings and forces and what everything comes from originally is some sort of a cosmic unity. And the Enuma Elish describes this unity as something like the union of opposites. And it's very mystical and paradoxical, and it's supposed to be. And these opposites are the masculine and the feminine, but they're also seen as gods, or a god and a goddess, right? Masculine and feminine. That's Apsu, the fresh water, and Tiamat, the salt water. And in the beginning, they were one thing. And Jordan calls this the Ouroboros. This is the image of the snake or the serpent swallowing its own tail. It's the image of something that's self-created. It's a very, very ancient religious image, maybe one of the very oldest. And it represents this idea that's encapsulated in the Mesopotamian myth of the Enuma Elish, that the thing from which all being flows, the source of everything, the thing that I will call God, or the Ouroboros in this case, is the union of these primordial gods, Tiamat and Apsu. In the beginning, they weren't separate. They weren't a god and a goddess. They were a god and goddess together as one thing. They weren't feminine and masculine. They were feminine and masculine together as one thing. And this idea is of a symbolic idea is of a sexual union. So you can imagine the male and the female together, right? When they're together, when they make the old beast with two backs, what happens? It's a generative, creative act. When the man and the woman come together, something new is born. So when the Ouroboros is the masculine and the feminine, Tiamat and Apsu together in this cosmic paradoxical union, this thing, that's what God is a creative act. And so you have all of the creation, all of the gods and all of the time and space and being and reality and the material cosmos, and all of this stuff is being created within this united set of opposites. And then there comes a time when the opposites have to be separated. And the myths describe the separation as a way of releasing all the things that were within that unity, allowing the potential to become actual, allowing the cosmos to come into existence, and all the forces and gods and people and everything that's there that will come about from it, to create the place where they can exist. And it requires this separation. Now, you'll see that in the Bible too. There's separation involved with creation. The night separated from the darkness. Eve separated from Adam's rib, and you see this sort of creation through separation. And this has a deeply significant psychological connotation. And it's very mystical, and it'll be difficult to describe on the fly, but I'll try to summarize. The idea is that God is associated with the thing in you that is alive. God is associated with life and consciousness, awareness. And the idea here is that experience is something sacred, right? When you have an experience, whatever you're experiencing is a manifestation of God, just like you yourself, right? Everything comes from the Ouroboros. Everything was created in it. So you are in God and of God simultaneously. Now, from a psychological perspective, it's easy to understand that you can't be conscious of anything if there's nothing apart from you to be conscious of. So in order to facilitate experience, in order for experience to be possible, what God has to do is to separate himself from himself. He has to turn himself into, he must take himself as a unity and turn himself into a duality. He has to become himself and something else. so that he can experience himself as something else. It's the only way you can experience. You experience things that are not you. They're apart from you in some important way. So you see the idea of separation involved. In order for you to be aware and conscious of anything, in order for you to be alive, because life and consciousness are so closely related, in order for you to be alive, there has to be something apart from you to experience. And so this idea of separation is deeply, deeply hidden in our myths, and they're associated with creation. All right, so that's enough teeing this up. So what I want to do here is I want to give you a series of arguments that make sense to me, or evidence that seems to point towards this idea of a primitive monotheism. What was Paleo Deo? What was the most ancient God? How was it understood? The modern scientists are going to tell you it was polytheism. Many gods, many spirits. So what I want to do here is I want to push back. So I'm going to call this first section Occam's razor. The idea here is, what is the simplest conception of God? Occam's razor tells you that the simplest explanation is often the correct one. Is the idea of many gods or many spirits the simplest conception? So I'm asking you, consider that while I kind of monologue a bit. All right, so one of these early anthropologists that I discovered was a guy named E.B. Tylor, Edward Burnett Tylor. I believe he's a English fellow, but he's one of these pioneer anthropologists, early 19th century anthropologists. A bunch of these guys, really, really fascinating guys. George Fraser, Max Mueller, Edward Tylor, lots of them. If you're interested in this stuff at all, check that out. So Edward Tylor, he wrote lots of things. And one of the things he said, I'll just read it to you. He said, "The phenomena of culture may be classified and arranged, stage by stage, in a probable order of evolution. No one comparing a longbow to a crossbow would doubt that the crossbow was a development arising from the simpler instrument." Okay, so he made this observation as an analogy to the study of human culture in general. This analogy about what comes first, the longbow or the crossbow, and how can you tell? Now, in general, this rule holds. The simpler instrument, the longbow, must have come first before the more complicated crossbow could have been invented, right? The simpler, Occam's razor, right? The simpler one must come first. And in general, this rule holds. More complex ideas develop from simple ones. Plain and simple. While this good common sense is mostly accepted, the study of religion is one great holdout. Nearly all scholars of religion maintain adamantly that organized religious systems arose as a blooming polytheism, or maybe some kind of animistic precursor to polytheism. So to explain a little, polytheism is the belief in many gods. Some people are going to nitpick and say that a spirit and a god are not quite the same thing, and maybe you're right. Maybe it's semantics, however. But the idea is that you might have had an idea of a world filled with spirits, and you might think that's different from a world filled with gods, but I don't think so. What is the difference between a spirit and a god? Is it a matter of degree? Is it a matter of kind? So again, most scholars think of religion just beginning as some kind of a polytheism or an animistic system with lots of spirits. Either way, potato, tomato, as far as I'm concerned. So he says, So anyway, the evolutionary history is clear. Right? Stone Age people, they believe, came to see the world as imbued by spirits. And then spirits become deified in the course of time. Maybe that requires some abstraction. And maybe so for a spirit to become a god. But this is kind of the evolutionary path that the anthropologists think is the case. Stone Age people come to see the world filled as though it's filled with spirits. After enough time goes by, those spirits become deified, they become gods. And only much, 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 much later, would the pantheon of deities be consolidated into one monotheistic being. You can look at monotheistic religions like Judaism, Christianity. You can see how recent they are relatively in human history when you compare them to like the Mesopotamian story we read a little bit ago, or all of the various forms of religion that occurred while we were not literate, and we'll never know what has come and gone before we get to it. But it seems like Christianity, Judaism are relatively recent in the grand scheme of things. So monotheism must be a later development. It must go in this way that I've just laid out to you. So one God comes from the idea of many gods. Really? Is it so cut and dry? What about old Edward Tyler? He says the simplest idea comes first. The longbow before the crossbow. Remember? But we're expected to believe in a religious context somehow many spirits come before the idea of one spirit? Humbug. Can I just say that? Humbug. This is a non-starter for me. Even though we can only speculate when we're dealing with things so deeply ancient, I'll speculate that human beings then are more or less like human beings now. And people today would absolutely need the idea of spirit before they would ever elaborate that into a pantheon. You see my point? To my mind, God or spirit came first. Only then could this simple idea be elaborated into a complex of many gods. Occam's razor. Of course, some type of a monotheism came first, because one God is simpler than many gods. I mean, the argument is that simple. And if that were my only argument, if I didn't have supporting evidence, maybe you could brush that off. Maybe you could say it's just one opinion among others, and who am I? And maybe you're right. But let's move on to the next section. I'm going to call this section High Gods, Animism, Henotheism, and Pantheism. All right, so I'm going to talk about high gods. I mentioned earlier that Wilhelm Schmidt wrote a book called High Gods in North America. I'll tell you a little bit more about what this idea means of a high god. I mean, it's pretty clear on the surface. You can think about the Greek pantheon, and we know who the king of the gods is. We know who sits on top of that hierarchy. His name is Zeus. He's the king of the gods, and this is really the idea of what a high god is. Now, what that means is not so clear, so we'll talk about that a little bit more. But then there's these other types of classifications or categories of religion. Animism, I mentioned. Animism is this idea of spirits. It's not so defined that you would call them gods necessarily. Usually this is a very primitive form of religion, and we see echoes of it in like tribal religions that exist today and historically. But the idea that the world is imbued by spirits. Everything is attached somehow to a spirit. Everything is therefore sacred, holy, something like that. Then we have henotheism, which is really interesting, and I'm going to focus on that in a minute. So let me just kind of pump the brakes on henotheism. And then pantheism. This is the idea that everything is God, right? All of the created cosmos, all of the forces that we intuit or experience, whether that be conscious beings like you and I, or animals, or maybe deities or spirits, all of the things that exist and all the forces within it, everything, a whole kit and caboodle, that taken as a whole is what we mean by God. This is the idea of pantheism. It just means all is God. But what about henotheism? Henotheism is the idea of a supreme being, a high God, but also allowing for other divine beings to exist. And it's kind of a strange little wrench to throw in the classification system. Is a henotheism a form of monotheism, or is it a form of polytheism? And how could you tell? And here's really the question that I want to ask, maybe direct this to the scholars. Is polytheism even a thing? Or is this kind of a oversimplification? Is it a classification error? Is it like what Jordan Peterson would call a low-resolution idea? So what do I mean by this? Certainly there's groups of people that believe in many gods. But you see, if those cultures are henotheists, if they have a supreme being with a bunch of little underlings, can't we call that a type of monotheism? I mean, it's certainly not accurate to call it polytheism, not entirely. It's not entirely accurate to call it monotheism either. It's interesting. So let's focus on henotheism as an idea for a second. So it's really defined as the worship of a single supreme God, but it doesn't deny the existence of other deities, lesser deities. So we were talking about Edward Tyler earlier, and I brought up Max Muller. So he's another one of these anthropologists, early, turn of the century anthropologist, British fellow, Max Muller. And he used this term henotheism to talk about Hinduism. He translated some of the Hindu scriptures, and a very famous guy, bringing kind of these Eastern ideas for the first time to Western consciousness. He used the word henotheism to describe Hinduism, whose scriptures mention lots and lots of deities as if they're one ultimate unitary divine essence. So the idea that the hundreds, thousands, hundreds of thousands of deities recognized in the Hindu pantheon, all of them are understood to be actually one unitary divine essence. All of these gods that they acknowledge and worship and sacrifice to, and all of that, have images of and stories about, all of that. But in truth, they see all of those gods as really one, as some sort of emanations of this one deity. Starting to sound a lot like monotheism, isn't it? Hinduism is characterized as sort of the epitome of polytheism, of a religion worshiping many gods, not recognizing a supreme being. But old Max Muller is telling us, after studying this stuff deeply, Hinduism really sounds a lot like monotheism. Now, henotheism is still described as a pluralistic theology, as a understanding of God or spiritual realm that it allows for a multiplicity. It allows for many deities, but one where different deities are viewed to be of the same essence, right? So many gods are actually seen to be one God. I mean, it rings really of a Christian trinity, doesn't it? But while we're talking about henotheism and while we're talking about Christianity, I'm going to say something I've said before, but in this context, I think it's important. If you're a Christian, like myself, or if you're a Jew or a Muslim or somebody in the monotheistic tradition, you consider yourself to be a monotheist. It's actually very important to the theology that you recognize only one God. Monotheism is critical, right? However, in Judeo-Christianity, we accept a pantheon of divine beings. It's not just God, right? It's angels, archangels, cherubim, demons, saints, right? The Virgin Mary. There's all kinds of other divine or semi-divine creatures that we allow under this monotheism, this Christian monotheism. And you can write that off any way you want. But the truth is, we see angels and demons as divine entities that are not mortal, that exist alongside God. Now, God is obviously more powerful. He's the one that created them. He's the one who their existence depends upon, just like ours. And yet, you have other divinities that exist in Judeo-Christianity, do you not? And yet, we call it monotheism. Well, is it henotheism? I think that's more accurate. And if Christianity is henotheist, if Judeo-Christianity is henotheist, can we really say henotheism is not monotheism? I think it is. All right, moving on. So tribal people. We're talking about, I immediately think about sub-Saharan African tribes. I think about Native American tribes. I think about Aboriginal tribes from Australia. These are the kind of examples that pop into my head. But these are people that have existed all throughout time. Even people in Asia and Europe and, all of these other places I haven't mentioned. Once upon a time, those people were living in a tribal way, very much like the Aboriginals and the sub-Saharan tribes in Africa and in the North and South America. And that's something that has existed at some point everywhere. And these tribal peoples are generally classified as polytheists. They believe in many gods, many spirits. Very often, though, these tribal people have a supreme god, a supreme being, or a high god. This is what Wilhelm Schmidt was pointing to. And this high god is almost always seen as the creator, as the sole creator of everything, as the single and sole origin, beginning of all things. And while there might be other divinities created and recognized and existing, just like in Christianity, we accept the existence of angels and demons and so on, the supreme being really is what it's all about. Nothing else would exist. No other deity would exist if it weren't for the supreme being. So he's in an order all by himself. So if you're going to call these things gods and you're going to rank them up in a hierarchy, the very highest level of a god, maybe we give that a different name. And that's the supreme being. And that's what I mean when I say God. And this is the prototypical great spirit of Native American lore. But it also appears in Africa, Australia, and South America too, and very likely in European prehistory, as is evidenced by such characterizations as the Germanic Nordic god Odin, who's called the All-Father, right? If you have a God who's the father of all, this is the single sole source and creator. This is the supreme being, the high God. Now, recently on the podcast, we've spoken of some of these high gods. Remember, we did an episode on the Omaha. We talked about Wakonde, the great spirit of the Omaha. And we talked about the Sioux version because they're closely related linguistically. And their high god is not Wakonde, but Wakantanka. But to bring this point home about high gods and these quote-unquote polytheistic tribes, let me just give you a list here of some of the key tribes around the United States who have an established and recognized supreme being, a great spirit. So let's start with the Iroquois. For those who don't know, originally the Iroquois are from the northeastern part of the U.S. Maybe think about New York State. The Iroquois have a high god. His name is Hawaneu. The Cherokee, kind of the southeastern part of the U.S., think about Georgia, Tennessee, the Carolinas. They have a supreme being named Unet Lanvihi. The Cheyenne, they're out in Minnesota and the Dakotas. They have a supreme being named Mehu. The Seminole down south in Alabama, Georgia, Florida, they have a supreme being they call Breathmaker. Isn't that cool? Breathmaker. The Pawnee out in Nebraska and Kansas, they have a supreme being called Tirawa. The Hopi in New Mexico and Arizona, Tawa. The Algonquin tribes, kind of along the Atlantic coast and the Great Lakes where I live, Gitche Manitow. The Blackfoot in the Great Plains out in Montana, Apsis Totoki. The Salish in the Pacific Northwest out in Washington, Oregon, Idaho, Amitkin. How about just South America for an example? Let's go to Peru. Let's talk about the Inca for a second. Their supreme being was Viracocha. You see what I mean? Polytheistic tribes, all of which recognize a supreme being. All of the spirits and spiritual powers descend from one high God. All are the great spirit. All these names I'm rattling off to you, they're all the single and sole creator. They're the source of the world and the spirits within it. One God to rule them all. You see what I mean? Not unlike Zeus as the king of the gods. All right, now let's just bounce over to Africa for a second. I want to try to send this point home. If we go to the Akan tribe in Ghana, their supreme being is Nyame. The Yoruba in Nigeria have Olorun. The Dinka of Sudan have Nyalik. The Maasai in Kenya and Tanzania have Nagai. And then most of East Africa, many tribes, have Malungu. And the San Bushmen way down in the south, Kagan, a supreme being in a polytheistic tribe. And not to be outdone, if we bounce over to Australia, out in New South Wales, the Wiradjuri tribe has Biami. The Rintre tribe has Altjira. And then the Yolngu in the Northern Territory has a supreme being called the Rainbow Serpent, or Jalungul. See what I mean? The relevant question here is, what is a high God? What does it mean for a single deity to be the source of all the others with dominion over them? Is this henotheism? Is it pantheism associated with some kind of an animistic worldview? And most critically, how is this not monotheism? Henotheism is one God as the source of all things. Pantheism is identical. God is identical to all things. Either way, monotheism, right? This idea of henotheism, this idea of a polytheistic society or a polytheistic understanding of God that maintains this idea of a supreme being, it transforms polytheism into monotheism. It's very clear. And that brings me to the next section. I'm going to call this section Primordial God as Ouroboros, one source of all things, okay? What I want to do here is I want to take some very old, very ancient religious systems, and I want to describe to you this supreme being idea. This is going to be much, much more akin to the Tiamat and Apsu example we were talking about from Mesopotamia. Remember, Tiamat and Apsu together, this divine unity that was there in the beginning, this Ouroboros. So first thing I want to do is I want to go back to the 14th century BC. I'm going to go back a long, long way. And I'm going to talk about ancient Persia and this religion called Zoroastrianism. We've talked about it before. To refresh your memory, a lot of Zoroastrianism has impacted Judeo-Christianity. And so it's kind of a forgotten religion, really, but it's extremely important historically and to the modern form of Christianity. And in Zoroastrianism, they really believe in a dual deity, a deity that's sort of split in two. Remember, we talked about that separation idea before. There's the sort of god of good called Ahura Mazda, and there's the god of evil called Angra Mainyu or Ahriman. And so you have a good god and a bad god. However, it's understood in Zoroastrianism that Ahura Mazda and Ahriman originally were together. Right, so some of the myths talk about Ahura Mazda creating Angra Mainyu and Spenta Mainyu. Other versions of the myth talk about Zervan, right? Zervan being something, so it's kind of confusing. Ahura Mazda is this idea of God, and Ahriman is this idea of the devil. But the idea of putting them together in the state they were before they were separated, when they were in Ouroboros unity, some of the Zoroastrians call this thing Zervan. All right, Zervan is the first principle, the primordial creator deity who engendered equal but opposite twins, Ahura Mazda and Angra Mainyu, right? God and the devil. So originally they were together. They were one thing. They're also seen as opposites, right? Good and evil. Opposites in union, just like Tiamat and Apsu. The feminine and masculine opposites. The salt and the fresh water, opposites, together. So Zervan is that thing from which God and the devil come. And you have to see this from an Ouroboros perspective. If there was one thing in the beginning and it split into two, then you might wonder why, right? So you have this idea of separation appearing in the story of creation here as well. The God of good and the God of evil were once together, and they had to separate themselves from each other. They had to become separate things. And this goes back to what I said before about consciousness and the importance of the other. You can't have one divine unity all by itself forever, because you don't have experience. You only have one thing. You need two things to have experience, right? So this is why separation is important. This is why the one must become many. And this is why we see that initial step of the Ouroboros, the one becoming two, becoming opposites. All right, Zervan was often associated with time and space, like infinite time and space. Zervan is also called the one, and he's called alone. And the idea here is to emphasize this divine unity. There is nothing else, only Zervan. So Zervan was a transcendental god. He's described as being neutral, without passions, not really making a distinction between good and evil. And you can understand why, right? Zervan is good and evil together. Ahura Mazda and Ahriman together, right? And there is no other, right? You have nothing to compare, good against evil, because they're one thing, right? So certainly there would be no distinctions between good and evil. There's no distinctions between anything within Zervan, within the one. All things are in the one, right? The potential for all things are there, and all opposites are there, and they're all together. That's the point. There is no distinctions. And I want you to understand this idea of all things together, or opposites together. We like to think about, it's easy to think about these sorts of things as canceling themselves out. Like, we understand what good means, we understand what evil means, but when you put them together, what does that mean? It's like the meaning disappears. Do you see what I mean? If you take all the colors of the rainbow and you put them together, all the different colors of light, and you put them together, you end up with white light that has lost the color. And this is the example here. When you put opposites together, they seem to go away. They seem to disappear into nothingness. But what you have to understand is that God, the Ouroboros, Zervan, all of this stuff we're talking about, it isn't nothing. When you take everything and you put it together, you don't get nothing. It seems that way. But what you do get is the potential for anything or everything to be. It just has to be separated from that unity. You see what I mean? All things are together, and you can separate them out and make things out of it. This is the idea of creating the cosmos, the many from the one, from God. See what I mean? All right, there was an ancient author named Eudemus in like the 300s BC, and he talks about a tribe of the Medes, and again, these are the people that will become the Persians. He describes them as considering time and space to be the primordial father, right? The primordial father of the gods, specifically Ahura Mazda and Ahriman, the god of light and the god of darkness. So I just want to kind of give you those historical references here where I can, just to try to paint this picture of Zervan. Now, from Zervan comes all of existence and all other sets of opposites. That's what existence is, and all of the other things that are going to come about. But they all roll back to one singularity, one big bang, one original form of life, one original God. You see what I mean? All right, I want to give you a comparison in the Greco-Roman world. In the Greco-Roman world, this god was not called Zervan, but it does exist. Now remember, the Greco-Roman pantheon is sort of quintessential polytheism, right? The belief in many gods. But pump the brakes. Let's see the henotheism here. The ancient Greeks and Romans believed, and this comes from Orpheus. It comes even from before the classical period in Greece, a deity by the name of Phanes. There's an ancient author named Damascius, and he describes Phanes as the first god expressible and acceptable to human ears. The first god. Now, we talked about the Derveni Papyrus, I don't know, a couple of weeks back, but this is one of those secret Orphic hymns that was supposed to be burned in a funeral pyre, but it ended up surviving, and we found it. And it says this. It says about Phanes, it says, "The firstborn king, upon him all the immortals grew, and everything else that had been born, he himself became." Okay, so I want you to see what he's saying. Phanes, this original primordial God, this original unity, all of the other gods come from him, right? Upon him, all the immortals grew. But not just that, everything else that's been created or born, all come from Phanes. And listen to this. It's not that Phanes created them. It says he himself became, right? He became them. Right, so Phanes is considered to be sort of this god associated with this cosmic egg. This is an image that goes right back to ancient Egypt, and inside that egg, inside this unity, all this creation is happening. And when the egg is finally cracked open, you release, just like Tiamat and Apsu. When they're separated into opposites, then you've created this realm where the potential, the spiritual realities can become actual, can be realized, can be real. All right, now if I go back in time a little bit and north a little bit to a tribe of Indo-Iranian people in Central Asia and Eastern Europe, these people are known as the Scythians. Very, very important historical group of people, but one that many people know very little about. These are an Indo-Aryan people, so they are very, very like the Persians, but a separate tribe, the Scythians. They have a goddess figure, very, very much like Zervan and Phanes. They call this deity Tabiti. Now, Tabiti was a goddess of the primordial fire, which alone existed before the creation of the universe and was the essence and source of all creation. So in the beginning, there was only Tabiti, the one divine thing. Now, the Scythian name Tabiti, it means the flaming one, but what that denotes is the cosmic principle out of which originated the multiple elements of the universe and the order in the world. So flaming one really means a lot more than just she's hot or associated with fire or what have you. But you can see some of the remnants of this, like another Indo-Iranian people who become the Persians. When they start worshiping in the Zoroastrian tradition, they have a holy flame, and that flame represents God, right? So there's this association between God and fire and light, and we see that in the Bible too, the way, the truth, the life, all that sort of thing. All right, so Herodotus is one of these ancient Greek historians, actually describes the Scythian pantheon, and he talks about there being 7 key primary gods. But he's very specific about this. He says in the first rank, there's only Tabiti, right? At the very top of the hierarchy, the original primordial God, the one, the unity from which all other things come, Tabiti. And from Tabiti, we get a second rank, which are binary opposites. They're called the father and mother of the universe, right? So the one separates into 2. You see that. You see separation involved. You see the monad, the one, becoming the many. And just like we had with the Mesopotamian story of Tiamat and Apsu, coming out of that cosmic unity, or in the Zoroastrian tradition, Ahriman and Ahura Mazda coming out of that unity of Zervan, here we have Api and Papeos. Now, Api is the earth and water mother, and Papeos is the sky father, so very much like Zeus or Jupiter. So you've got a goddess, the water goddess, and you have a god, the sky father, right? Masculine and feminine. You have these opposites that are created from the unity. And I do have to say that Api, A-P-I, sounds a heck of a lot like Apsu, right? Now, that's the male version in the Sumerian story, in the Babylonian story. But Apsu is also a god of water. It's like Api is the water mother. So there's some interesting parallels here. So lastly, I want to talk about Brahmanic Hinduism. I want to talk about a more recent form of religion that has a very similar thing involved. So in Brahmanic Hinduism, there's this idea of the Trimurti. It's like the 3-in-1. You kind of get this idea of a trinity as well from it. But it's a theological idea that the supreme God is manifest in 3 forms. As a Christian, you can see that, Father, Son, Holy Spirit, that kind of thing. But in Hinduism, it's Brahma, Vishnu, Shiva, the creator, the preserver, the destroyer. So you have the whole cycle of existence in this unity, whom they regard as Brahman, right? So Brahma, Vishnu, Shiva together are Brahman. They are one God in 3 forms. Now, they call Brahman Nirguna Brahman. Nirguna Brahman means God without attributes. And to me, this sounds a lot like Henotheism again, by the way. It's just an explicitly unitive version of Henotheism. But this idea of Nirguna Brahman is important because it says basically that the ultimate, God in and of itself, if you could understand that, which you can't, but if you could, it's something like everything all wrapped into one. They call Nirguna Brahman God without attributes, but really what that means, that's an identical statement to saying God with all attributes. Right? It's like you can say that Zeus is the god of the sky and the god of thunder, but he only has certain attributes. But Nirguna Brahman has them all. And that has the effect of making Nirguna Brahman sort of sound like nothing again, right? Like if I can pull out this idea of Zeus by the associations of king of the gods and thunder and sky, if I can pull that god out and say, this is the one I'm talking about, you cannot do that with Brahman. Brahman is all of those things. So because you can't pull out something that's distinct, you could say, this thing. You can't do that, right? Not with Brahman. Brahman has all attributes at once. So having all attributes at once is very much like having no attributes at all. There's nothing to distinguish you as anything because you're everything. Does that make sense? Because it's all tied up into this idea of the Ouroboros. And I want to read you one of the Upanishads. It's the Maitreya Upanishad, and it goes like this. All existence is the Brahman, the supreme being dividing himself into many forms. Let me become all things. Whew, buddy, you see what I mean? The supreme being has to divide itself into many forms to become all things. That's the other gods, Brahma, Vishnu, Shiva, but it's also all created reality. All of it, all existence is Brahman. You see that? One God, the supreme being. All things roll back up to that one thing. That is identical as saying all things are God. You see what I mean? And that includes all the other deities. They're all God. One thing, a unitive experience, a monotheism. That brings me to the next section. I'm going to call this pre-classical and classical evidence. So I just want to kind of compound this evidence for you. We talked about Orphism a little bit because Orphism comes before even some of these pre-Socratics are going to reference Orpheus, people like Pythagoras and Parmenides, even Plato. So Orphism is this mystery religion associated with ancient Greece and Turkey. It is very, very, very mystical and ancient and interesting. I want to read to you a couple of these fragments that we have. Again, Orphism was supposed to be kept very secret, but we do have some things that I'll share with you. One of the Orphic fragments says this. Remember, we're talking about the ancient Greek world, a religion, a very religious people, and they believe in many gods. This is supposed to be a polytheistic society. And this is what Orpheus says. God holds the beginning and end in the middle of all existing things. God holds the beginning and end in the middle of all existing things. God in the singular, not the gods. God in the singular is the beginning and end, the Alpha and Omega, and everything in between of all things that exist. And there's a fragment of an Orphic hymn, again by Damascus. who says, the one original element, time, the two, ether and chaos. All right, so all that requires some explaining. But he's talking about the original unity. He says the one original element, that's the Ouroboros, that's Zervan, Tabiti, that's this original divine unity. The original element is time. The ancient Greeks would know time as chronos, right? But they associated this with phanes. Remember that guy we talked about earlier? This divine unity, phanes, he's called the time-begotten egg, right? So this is how the phanes character is associated with time. So the one original element is phanes, the unity from which all the gods come. And then what's the second? He says, ether and chaos. So the one, phanes, becomes two. You get the separation as a part of creation. The one becomes two, a set of opposites. In this case, the ether and chaos. And that brings us really to the pre-Socratics. Many of whom, now remember, these are all polytheistic pagans, but the pre-Socratics were obsessed with this idea of the monad, the idea of reality or of spiritual reality, like the idea of God, as being one thing, as being a divine unity. So let's start way back. Let's start around 700 BC with Hesiod, who said this. He gave us this little ditty. The gods and mortal men sprang from one source. Did you hear that? Remember, these are polytheistic pagans. And they said the gods and mortal men sprang from one source. So you have that monad, you have that divine unity. What is that one source? Now, if you're a polytheist and you believe in gods, and certainly you believe in human beings because you are one, and you believe that they come from one source, what can you call this source? It's something different than the gods, isn't it? It's something higher than the gods, isn't it? It's something from which all the gods come. All of the gods roll up into this Brahman, into this one source, into this Zervan, Phanes, Tabiti thing, into this Ouroboros, this divine unity that was there in the beginning. The gods and mortal men sprang from one source, Hesiod says. All right, so 100 years later, we have another Greek author, Acucelius, in the 6th century. He says this: chaos was the first principle, and after it, the pair, Erebus, the male, and night, the female. So you have this sort of theogony, this description of the creation of the world, and it says chaos was the first principle, right? There was one God in the beginning that he's calling chaos. And from it, a pair of opposites, Erebus, the male, night, the female. Right? Just like Tiamat Napsu, just like Ahriman Angramanyu, the one becomes the two. There's this separation that happens. That's how you get many from the one. It's through this process of diffusion, through this process of separation or dissociation. Right? It's the one that becomes the many. It doesn't create shit. It becomes everything that exists. All right, so if we go fast forward a little bit, lifetime to 560 BC approximately, we have the philosopher Anaximander in ancient Greece who said, the non-limited is the source from which all existing things derive their existence. It is immortal and indestructible. This one thing called the non-limited is the source of all other things. What is that? See how Anaximander there's not really a word for it, right? If the gods and mortal men sprang from one source, what is this source? Can you call it a god? It's different from that. It created the gods. So Anaximander gives it this new name, the non-limited, right? This is what a Christian means when they say God. Anaximander, it means when he says the non-limited, right? Because there's a difference between God with a capital G and gods with a lowercase g. And in 560 BC, Anaximander believed there was a source behind all of the gods in existence that's immortal and indestructible, and he calls it the non-limited. This is God with a capital G. This is henotheism. This is monotheism. Do you see what I'm saying? But there's more. Xenophanes, 30 years later, he says this: There is one God among gods and men, the greatest, not at all like mortals in body or mind. He sees as a whole, thinks as a whole, and hears as a whole. He sets everything in motion by the thought of his mind. All right, so we could go lots of places here, but I want you to just take it on the surface for what it says. There is one God among the gods and men, the greatest. There is a supreme being. And he says, it is not at all like mortals in body or mind. This is important. Remember, the Greeks believed that the pantheon of gods were like people in body and mind. They looked like humans, but just a little bit bigger and more powerful. They had sex. They cheated. They lied. They raped. They did all kinds of things. They go to war with each other. They're just like human beings in body and mind. But Xenophanes says there's one God who's not like that, the supreme being, who sees as a whole and thinks as a whole and hears as a whole, as a unity, as a oneness. You see what I mean? All right, skip 30 years ahead to Heraclitus, 500 BC, and you have this quote: "That which alone is wise is one. It is willing and unwilling to be called by the name of Zeus." It's interesting, right? There is that which alone is wise is one, right? So you have this deity that is a unity, it's one. He says it's willing and unwilling to be called by the name of Zeus. What that tells me is that there's some conceptualization about what Zeus is that is accurate when you're trying to understand what this supreme being is. But then there's parts of it that aren't accurate, like what Xenophanes told us a minute ago. It's not like a human being in body or mind, and that's how we think of Zeus. So there's something that's unwilling, right, about this to associate itself with Zeus. At the same time, it is the supreme being. It is the king of the gods. And that's what Zeus is. All right, Heraclitus gave us one more. He says, Hesiod did not understand day and night, for they are one. God is day, night, winter, summer, war, peace, satiety, famine. Now, this might be the most powerful quote we've read. He's saying Hesiod did not understand day and night, for they are one. He's saying the opposites, right? And we can think about this in lots of different ways, but we've talked about some of the key historical versions of this. Ahriman and Ahura Mazda. This duality that comes from the separation of the one. He's saying they aren't different. They're not separate. These opposites are actually one thing. It's Phanes again. It's Zervan again. It's the Ouroboros again. He's saying you have to understand God as both good and evil, as both night and day, right? It's the unity. And what happens when you unify opposites? You get this strange paradoxical disappearance that we talked about earlier. You take hot, you take cold, you put them together. What's left? I don't know. You take good, you take evil, you put them together. What's left? I don't know. Maybe nothing. But no, it's not that. It's like the stem cell. It's that which can become anything. It's what I call potentiality. And that's what God is. That's what the Ouroboros represents. Potentiality. Whatever it is that we call God, that from which anything can spring forth into existence. That thing is called potentiality, whatever that means. This is what the Ouroboros represents, the union of opposites. Heraclitus says day-night, like they're one thing. Day, night, winter, summer, war, peace, good, evil. You see what I mean? The potential and the actual together. That's what God is. I'm going to skip ahead here to 200s AD to a fellow named Diogenes Laertius. And he says this: God is one and the same with reason, fate, and Zeus. In the beginning, he was by himself. He transformed the whole of substance, adapting matter to himself. From the monad, evolved the dyad. So Diogenes is telling us that when we think about reason, like intellect, consciousness, thinking, awareness, fate, the order in the world, how things occur, the natural laws that things follow, and Zeus, right? the divinity and the king of all the spirits, the divine realm and powers, all of that, right? All of that wrapped into one. That's something like what God is. And he says, in the beginning, he was by himself, right? One God. And he says he transformed the whole of substance, adapting matter to himself. From the monad, from the one, comes the dyad, the two. From the one, from God, comes the many, all of the created things that we call, the cosmos. All right, now, I'd be remiss if I didn't leave out Hermeticism, because this was an important religious movement as well. Hermes Trismegistus, we talked about that not too long ago. So I want to talk a little bit about some examples from Hermeticism, because Hermeticism also was obsessed with this idea of the monad, like the pre-Socratics. And remember that the Hermetic tradition was super influential in certainly the West, from late antiquity all the way through to the Middle Ages. So let me just read a couple of these phrases that come from the Hermetic tradition, starting with the Emerald Tablet of Hermes, which says, "As all things were from one, his father is the sun and his mother the moon. The force of forces penetrates into everything." Right? So as all things were from one, right? That's one source of all things. That's the unity that was there in the beginning. And then we see this dyad forming, right? That's the one thing separates into two things. That's the Father, the Son, and the Mother, the Moon. And then he says, the force of forces, right? This is the unity. This is the thing he's calling God. The force of forces penetrates into everything. God is in everything. That includes the deities, right? That includes the polytheistic gods. God, with a capital G, is in all of them too. They all roll back up into the one source of everything. The Emerald Tablet says all things were from one. All right, and the Corpus Hermeticum gives us this quote. It goes like this: "With logos, not with hands, did the world maker make the world, so that thou shouldest think of him as everywhere and every being, the author of all things, and one and only, who by his will all beings hath created." Right? So all beings flow from this one thing. And again, he says with the logos he made them, and so it's coming from his mind. So you have this interesting idealism that's sprinkled in all of this. And it says so that we should think of him, so that we should think of God as everywhere and everything. God is everywhere and everything. He's also the author of all things, the one and only. You see this, the monad, the divine unity that becomes everything. So while we're talking about this idea of the one becoming the two, this sort of process of separation that creates multiplicity from the one thing, you see this idea in classical mythology everywhere. You just don't really recognize it. So what I mean here is that in the classical world, the gods, especially the high gods, are always paired up with a consort. So you have a god and a goddess that are associated with each other like husband and wife. In the Greek world, you have various versions of this. Like in the original creation story of Hesiod, you have Gaia and Ouranos. So you have the earth and you have the heavens, right? That's the original goddess and the original god. God and consort, male and female. You see what I mean? You've got this separated opposites that are separated from the unity, phanes, right? The unity. So you have Gaia and Uranus, and then Gaia and Uranus get usurped by Kronos and Rhea, and then Kronos and Rhea get usurped by Zeus and Hera. It's always a consort. It's always a set of opposites, masculine and feminine, god and goddess. Even in Egypt, you have Isis and Osiris. You see what I mean? And if we go further east, you can still see this idea even in ancient China and Taoism with the yin and the yang, the masculine and the feminine. In every one of these situations, these things are considered to be one. They're considered to have a common source and to go together. All right, that brings me to the next section, which I'm going to call Vestiges from Deep Antiquity. There's some maybe some more speculative stuff in here, but I think this is important. So I don't know if you've ever noticed, I first ran into this study in the Bible, that the word in the Bible that's used for God, one of them, is El. And El is a proper name. El is the name of a Canaanite god. In fact, the high god, one of these high gods of a pantheon. But in the Hebrew Bible, El is the only God, the monotheistic God of the Jews, right? So El is the name for God that's used. Yahweh later on is another, but El originally. And we see El, we see Elohim, we see Elion, we see all of these words in the ancient Hebrew scriptures. But what's interesting about this El character is that the name for God means God, right? So to call God El is to call God God in the singular. You see what I mean? God in the singular, not the gods, but God in the singular. So El can mean, the high God Yahweh, or it can mean just like the word God. I could use it, interchangeably. But it gets more interesting because you see this not just in the Bible, you see this sort of everywhere. I mean, if you go back to the ancient Sumerians, which predates the Bible by thousands of years, this is the earliest society we have records of, essentially, and their high god is called An or Anu. And the logogram, they use cuneiform writing, so the logogram that they carved to mean Anu, the high god, that same logogram means God in the singular, right? So El, the God of the Hebrews, means God. An, the God of the Sumerians, means God. Even Zeus for the Greeks, remember, Zeus is Deus. Deus means God. So it's a proper name for a high God, Zeus, El, and Anu. But even so, the name for God means God. I want you to understand what I'm trying to get at here is that the name of the high God means God in the singular. One God, a monotheism. I want you to see that. And it would be one thing if it was just El or if it was just An, but it's everywhere. Another thing, which is maybe more speculative, is that this An or Anu God from ancient Sumeria, that word has a cognate in the Proto-Indo-European family, in the language group. Now, the Sumerians were not Proto-Indo-European, and so this is why it's speculative. There's not a whole lot of evidence as to why there would be linguistic connections between the Sumerians and the Indo-Europeans, but the god Anu is cognate with the Proto-Indo-European word for one. Anu means one. And if you listen carefully to Indo-European languages today, what is one in German? Ein, right? Uno, Anu, An. You see what I mean? The high God means one. Isn't that interesting? Then there's this weird thing, the phenomena that happens in the among the ancient authors, where gods become, I just call this the conflation of identities, where gods are basically seen as interchangeable, where they share an identity. And I want you to understand, like, if somebody came up to a Christian and told a Christian that that Yahweh, that your God is identical to Brahma in India or something, there's a lot of people that would resist that idea. I mean, maybe most people, they would say that's blasphemous, right? It's like, your God's not my God. But in the ancient world, this was not a problem. And I just want to point out to you, that's strange. Why is it that the identities of gods seem to be interchangeable and the people are totally okay with it, as though there's this equivalency among gods, as if these gods are all the same? And I think this leads some evidence to this idea of a unity or a oneness among the idea of divinity in general. So as an example, Herodotus, this goes back to the 400s BC, he recognizes that the Greek Zeus, the Egyptian Ammon, and the Persian Ahura Mazda are all the same. They're all kings of the gods. He makes the same identity between Hades, the Egyptian Osiris and the Persian Ahriman. They're all gods of the underworld. Dionysus and Osiris, right? Gods of agriculture, death, and resurrection. Hera and Hathor, Artemis and Anahita. And then you have Tacitus in about around 100, in the hundreds BC, who talks about some of the Germanic tribes, right? He talks about Tiwaz or Tyr as the same god as Mars and Ares, and the same as the Celtic god. Oh boy, I'm going to mispronounce it. Tuatis, maybe. And then he says the same thing about Odin. He says Odin is Mercury, but also the Celtic Lugus. And then Plutarch, another ancient author, talks about Isis and Demeter being the same. They're fertility gods associated with resurrection. So you've got this sort of weird conflation of identities in the ancient world that is perfectly accepted. So the question is, are they different gods or are they one? Imagine accepting these conflations. Imagine being okay with this. What does that mean? All right, that brings me to my next section, which will be the last one before my conclusion. I'm going to call this one Reform Movements, a return to orthodoxy. So when I'm talking about reform movements here, what I want to mention is a very significant changes in the religious structure in various societies that were important historically and interesting for this conversation. So if we go back to, again, the 14th century BC, if we go back to ancient Egypt, we're going to see a pharaoh whose name was Akhenaten, who overturned all of the religious orthodoxy in ancient Egypt. He said, look, there is only one God, the sun god Aten. All of the other gods of Egypt, all of the other gods either aren't real, don't exist, or are just characterizations of Aten, the one God. And this has reverberated. This decision has reverberated throughout history. It had impacts on Judeo-Christianity. There's a tremendous amount of overlap between Moses and Akhenaten, and there's lots of interesting stuff to get into here. But what I want to do is I want to read for you a bit of a hymn, a famous hymn to Aten that comes from Amarna from this period of Akhenaten. And remember, this is ancient Egypt, one of these prototypical polytheistic, many-god worshiping societies. And listen to this religious reformer who wants to restore some kind of original authenticity to the Egyptian religion. And he writes this hymn to the one God. And it goes like this. O living Aten, thou who are the beginning of life. Thou art the sun, O one God who has no fellow. Thou createst the earth according to thy will. Thou createst all things by thyself. Thou art in my heart. The whole earth is in thy hand, even as thou hast made them. At thy rising all live. At thy setting they die. So I just want you to hear how monotheistic that is. Thou art the beginning of life, O one God who has no fellow. All was created by thy will. All was created by thyself. You see that? One God. So I see this as less of a revolutionary change, at least in the eyes of Akhenaten, and more of a restoration of some more ancient understanding of God, right? Some restoration, a return to monotheistic orthodoxy or henotheistic orthodoxy. This is what Akhenaten was trying to do. All right, next let's talk about the El cult and the Canaanite tribes. So we talked about the Canaanite religion a little bit. We talked about El, the high god. We see a kind of a split that happens where the Israelites, or the people that will become the Israelites, branch off from this larger tribe of Canaanite people, of Semitic people living there in the Middle East. And they, instead of worshiping this whole pantheon of Canaanite deities, they decide just to worship El. We have evidence of this after, around 500 BC when the Jews returned from Babylon, from exile in Babylon. So they come back to Jerusalem. And so you have this classical Canaanite religion, which is considered polytheistic, of course. It involves the high god, El, or Elyon, which means most high, right? The high god. And he has a consort. Remember, just like we talked about Zeus and Hera, Kronos and Rhea, Gaia and Oranos. So El has a consort. Her name is Asherah. So you have the god and the goddess, the high god and the goddess, the male, the female, the opposites in union. El and his Asherah. But you also have a bunch of other names that you would recognize from the Bible as well. Baal, or Baal, Astarte, Moloch, and of course, Yahweh. And this may be controversial, but I just want to tell you, Baal is a title, not really a name. Baal means Lord, okay? And Baal is also called in certain places Yah. So you can see there's kind of an unusual conflation between the names Yahweh and the name Yah. Now, both Baal in the Ugaritic texts and Yahweh in the Psalms are called cloud rider. Like that's kind of a title given to them. They're sky gods, storm gods. They're called cloud rider. So many people believe that Yahweh and Baal are actually identical. Baal is a title. It means Lord. It's not a name. So it could be when we see Baal called Yah, and we have this same title being used for Yahweh and Baal, cloud rider, that they may actually be the same God. Well, that's interesting, especially if you're a reader of the Old Testament, you'd find that interesting. Now, Yahweh is considered to be the son of El in the pantheon, and also Baal was considered to be the son of El. So you have some more parallels there. And then later, there's a development that happens. One of these Canaanite tribes that will become the Israelites, they replaced El with Yahweh. So once upon a time, there was a whole pantheon of gods, El at the top, Yahweh is one of his sons. And one of these tribes decides, you know what? El is Yahweh. There's only one God. There's only one God. El is Yahweh. Okay? And so they end up putting Yahweh in the place of El as the high God. And then they just disavow all the others. All the other gods become demons. And that's the perspective you see in the Old Testament. So we have a polytheistic group, maybe you call them henotheistic since they have a high god El, and it becomes what Jewish monotheism. Similarly in ancient Persia, this is very similar with Zoroastrianism. So at the time, before the prophet Zarathustra or Zoroaster, in the Iranian plateau, you just have tribal polytheism, right? It's closely related to Vedic polytheism, which is kind of what Hinduism comes from, but it features gods like Ahura Mazda and Mithra and Attar and some of these gods. And it was dominant in Persia until Zarathustra comes around. So we're talking, 14th century BC or so. And he raises Ahura Mazda to the position of the high god. Now, he still recognizes an accompaniment of angels and demons. There's still all these other spiritual beings that exist, but Ahura Mazda now is the source origin creator of all of them, the high god. And again, Zarathustra, the prophet, sees this reform as bringing orthodoxy back, of taking the polytheism where it's wrong and wrongly understood and wrongly practiced and returning it to this true henotheistic form of monotheism with Ahura Mazda on top as the supreme being. Now, I mentioned that the Zoroastrian Persians are closely related to the Vedic Hindus, and so let's talk about Hinduism for a second, because there was also a important reform movement in India that came about with the Upanishads. So many people know the Hindus have the Vedas as their holy books. And after some time, the Upanishads were written, and it brings a revolutionary understanding to the religion. It's a reform movement. It's often called Advaita Vedanta, and it's about what they call non-dualism. And this is interesting. I mean, this was a philosophical revolution and around the 9th century AD of the Vedic religion, where Brahma is not merely seen as the high god and the source of the others, but as non-dual, as one in the same as the entire cosmos, along with its material and spiritual manifestations. So this is like the ultimate unity. This is a kind of a pantheism as well. It's all things that exist, including the gods. They're one thing, non-dual, right? This is non-dual is another word for the one or the monad that we heard about from the pre-Socratics and the Hermetics and from the Orphics, right? God is one, non-dual. This is Narguna Brahma I was talking about. God without qualities, God without attributes. It's identical to this idea of God with all properties. God is one. See what I mean? That brings me to the Hypsisterians. So I'm going to shout out Neil from the Gnostic Informant podcast, because I had never heard of the Hypsisterians until I was introduced to them on his show. The Hypsisterians are a religious group that appears in ancient Greece after the 1st century AD. I had no idea. Remember, ancient Greece is a prototypical polytheistic society. And this group called Hypsisterians, okay, they were worshipers of a god that they call Theos Hypsistos. Theos Hypsistos means the Most High God, just like Elion in the Hebrew, the Most High, the Supreme Being, the High God. They only worship Theos Hypsistos. Now, there's evidence of these Hypsisterians and their worship going back, I mean, really a couple hundred-year period, but from between the 1st century and the 4th century AD, mostly in Turkey and the Black Sea area there. We have some ancient authors that talk about them. About 374 AD, Gregory of Nyzensis, he says this: they reject idols and sacrifices, but reverence fire and lights. They observe the Sabbath, but despise circumcision. These lowly men call themselves Hypsistarai, and the Almighty is, so they say, the only object of their worship. Right? So interesting, right? It's like he's making these points to distinguish them from Jews, right? They're not Jews. He says that they observe the Sabbath, but they despise circumcision. So these are not Jews. They're converts from Greek pagan orthodoxy. And they've chosen to worship only the high God and the high God only. It would be like deciding Zeus was the only God that really exists and just worshiping him. That's what they're doing. And you can even see like the incredulity in his voice when he says, the Almighty is, so they say, the only object of their worship. It's like in a polytheistic world, he doesn't even believe it could be true that they're only worshiping the Almighty. So they say. Right? And there's an inscription that we have from a little later, a Hypsisterian inscription that describes Theos Hypsistos. It describes God as self-begotten, right? Self-created, undisturbed, not permitting a name, many named, and dwelling in fire. So you have this paradox here, not permitting a name and many named, which is a paradox much like those opposites that we were talking about before. But there's also some interesting stuff here. When it says not permitting a name, I just can't help but think about another unitary philosophy, religious philosophy, that's Taoism in China, where the Tao is the one. The Tao is the divine unity. And in the Tao Te Ching, in their holy text, they say the Tao that can be spoken of is not the real Tao. It's like the moment you put a name to it, you've changed it from what it is to something else, and you're on the course of error. So he says, not permitting a name, and it just rings of this to me. Like putting a name on it is in some way making the infinite finite. You're ruining it. You're doing something wrong. And again, dwelling in fire. So you see this light and fire, all this stuff is a common symbolic association all throughout this, right? I also want to mention that not permitting a name and many named parallels something we heard from Heraclitus earlier. You remember what he said? He said, willing and unwilling to be called by the name of Zeus, right? Willing and unwilling, not permitting a name, but many named. See what I mean? The one and the many, the unity, all of this stuff. And with the Hypsisterians, you have this reform movement happening in ancient Greece in the classical period at the height of polytheism. So whether we're talking about Greece, whether we're talking about India, Persia, whether we're talking about the Middle East or Egypt, in every one of these areas, we have these very important historical religious reform movements that are all of them coming back to a henotheism or a monotheism from a polytheism. And I didn't include this, but obviously Islam falls right into that category. A prophet who comes to take these tribal Arabs that are worshiping many gods and bring them into a monotheistic faith. You see what I mean? Wave after wave of reform movements, correcting our error, bringing us back to the truth of some kind of a henotheism or monotheism. And that brings me to my conclusion. Okay. So what I was most hoping to illustrate with all of this is that the idea of a primordial unitive deity was clearly present in the minds of the ancients, as much as with those people living today and historically in tribal societies very closely with nature. Because this idea is present in our oldest myths as well, it cannot be ignored, even in the context of so-called polytheism. Which brings me to the question of classification. It seems to me that the line between polytheism and monotheism is blurry, to say the least, and pretty unhelpful, actually. What is the difference, would you say, between the belief that there is only one God and the belief that all things, divinities or otherwise, flow from and depend on one God? How about a belief system like Hinduism that recognizes a host of supernatural realities, but simultaneously claims that they all roll up, so to speak, to one ultimate reality? On the flip side, we have the Christian Trinity, which allows for one distinctly monotheistic God in three persons. The death knell for this classification system for me is the problem of henotheism and pantheism, which provide a far more accurate description of the religious systems which actually exist and have existed. The so-called polytheistic world, nearly without exception, admits a single source for the gods and men. This is a problem of semantics, a problem of what we mean by the word God. If I can be a Christian who believes in one God, but allows also for divine angels and demons too, am I any less of a monotheist? What if I'm a pagan who sees gods in nature and inhabiting the heavens, but believes they all came from one divine source? Am I a polytheist or a monotheist? It's impossible to say now, isn't it? Now take all of this and add to it the perpetual resurgence of monotheistic or unitive ideas within these pagan systems. We see how the pantheons of classical Greece and Rome preserved echoes of a single divine source. Hesiod calls it chaos, Orpheus calls it phanes, and the Persians and Scythians, of course, with Zirvan and Tabiti. But each time the cultural understanding shifts too far into polytheism, new prophets and reformers appear to set things right. The pre-Socratic sages reminded the Greeks to remember the monad. Zarathustra and Akhenaten pulled their people together under the banner of a single conception of God. Even the Hindus, whose pantheon is unmatched among world religions, is brought back to unity, back into non-duality by Shankara. The question is why? Why do we grasp so tightly to the idea of God as a divine unity? Where did such an inspiration come from to be found at the root of seemingly all religious systems? And why do wave after wave of prophets return to perpetually remind us of this? I could point again to Occam's razor and appeal to logic, But why bother? It's as clear as crystal to me that the reason boils right down to human experience. We human beings have the potential for religious or mystical experience. It's built right in, deeply, deeply in. It's a human instinct. And when, if you're lucky, that experience finds you, you're left with one lasting impression: that all is one, that all is God. And any religious system that fails to recognize this is revealed to be corrupt and broken and in need of reform. And thereby arises the mystics and prophets and sages and shaman to correct our human error and show us the way, the truth, and the life.
Well, there you have it.